Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is a legend in the world of comics. It's writer Mark Waid. Mark, welcome back to Comic Culture.
Good afternoon, Professor. It's good to talk to you again.
Now, Mark, you are known for writing some of the most iconic characters and some of the most iconic storylines in comics, but you also are known for switching genres. And I'm wondering, as a writer, how you make that distinction between let's say action adventure, superheroics, or maybe something you're doing in Archie which might be more comedic, relationship driven, and how you kind of get a handle on the characters.
To take the first one, it's actually less of a gear shift than it might look, because I'm still drilling down on story, which is, and in its simplest form, a story is somebody wants something, something's in their way. How do they succeed or not in achieving, coming over an obstacle? And even in the context of the humorous Archie comics, it was still that basic structure. And if you add to that the fact that regardless of what genre I'm working in, I tend not to write cynical pieces. I tend to, not Pollyanna, not happy, chirpy, not super smiley, but I tend to take my characters in a less cynical direction. And if you bake that into the character, if you bake that together with the characters, then you can switch genres pretty easily. You're still telling stories. But as far as the characters go, I mean, this is what I get for 50 years of reading them. I know them better than I know my own family when it comes to Superman or Wonder Woman or the X-Men or Spider-Man or Archie. So in terms of getting a handle on those characters, I pretty well know them. In my head, I've been writing them for 50 years. And those that I might want to brush up on, I just always go back to basics. I always go back to, founding principles, go back to the earliest stories and look at what the original creators were trying to achieve, because these characters that have been around since before I was born, I feel very strongly that there are reasons these characters have existed for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And if we knew exactly what those X factors were, we'd be cranking out more comics with characters that last 30, 40, 50 years every day. We don't do that. There are X factors, nuances, little things that, there's so many moving pieces to Superman. There's so many moving pieces to what makes Wonder Woman work, that I just feel very strongly that you try to do as little damage as you possibly can. To really come at it the Hippocratic Oath of do no harm.
I think Carl Kiesel did something on social media recently who said that, it's great reading one of your books because not only are the stories fun and exciting, but on top of that, the characters themselves become what we really remember. It's not so much who the villain was, it's more who the heroes are and the husband-wife dynamic or something along those lines. So with this mindset of do no harm, how do you make a change in a character that is something that the audience will connect with, and at the same time return the character to the toolbox when you're done with it in a way that the next writer gets it in that shiny new condition?
Well, you do have to bear in mind that the next guy who comes along, the next woman who comes along, the next person who comes along and takes the series after you is, odds are they're going to drop a piano on what you did. That's just kind of what the industry needs. How the industry breeds things is everything is a fresh new start. Every time some other new creator comes on a book, it's billed as, stuff you've never seen before. It's a brand new look at this character. And I get that. I'm not ashamed to say I probably dropped a couple of pianos in my own time. But I'm not sure I quite understand the change part of the question, because I'm not sure that I'm really affecting big change in these characters in a way that you can't, as you say, put the toys back in the toy box.
Well, let's say we're talking about your run on Flash, where you have the relationship between Wally and Linda, and when you are able to take those two characters and put them in a permanent relationship where there's, I guess, as permanent as there is in comics, where there's rings involved, that's a change that I guess will stick. But so I guess that's getting back to the question would be, when you make a change like that, you still pass the baton, so to speak. So
sure, that makes sense. I mean, and that in that context, I wouldn't have done that in year one or year two. But by that time, I've been writing the book for like 7.5 years. So I felt like I had a handle on what made that work. That was, I mean, frankly, it wasn't any real different, really any different than what the relationship they had before. They were just rings on their fingers. A more drastic example is Superman and Lois Lane getting married. That's you're breaking a lot of toys if you're doing that. You're getting rid of the secret identity. You're getting rid of an eternal love triangle between Clark, Superman, and Lois. These are all engine pieces that have served it well for 75, 80 years or whatever. I guess by the time they were married, 60 years. And that's where I personally would be more nervous about making that level of change, because then you're breaking things. You're not building at that point. You're also breaking. And that's not a criticism. Obviously, it's done quite well for them over the years. And that's the Superman that people want to read about now. But I stand by my statement, which is in order to build that, you had to break some stuff. And I'm not comfortable breaking stuff.
My question, I guess, as a follow-up is, when you're working on a book like Superman, obviously there are going to be those rules that you don't want to break. But when you're working on a character that maybe doesn't have the fan following or isn't as popular, is it easier for you to just make some bigger changes and see, well, the book might get canceled anyway, so if the readers like it, they're going to buy it more, and if they don't, the book's going to get canceled anyway?
It is. Exactly. And frankly, that's kind of a catbird seat you want to be in every once in a while. You can like that opportunity of being given something that's so broken that it can only go up. And then you can roll the dice. Legion of Superheroes is a good example. Not so much the first of the 45 times I rebooted the series, but the second time with Barry Kitson, where the Legion was just in the sales toilet, and it was a great property, but nobody could find a way to make it accessible to modern readers. And so that was a case where we rolled the dice and broke everything and kind of rebooted it from scratch, rebooted the whole mission statement, treated the characters as if you've never seen them before. And it was very successful for a very short period of time. So that's a roll of the dice, but that also could very easily have gone very poorly if the small handful of existing Legion readers had come after us with pitchforks and torches.
Now, you mentioned Barry Kitson, and you've worked with a number of artists on longer runs, and I'm wondering how that collaboration works, because is it something where you are coming up with a story and delivering them the full script? Is it something where you are calling them up and seeing what they want to do with the characters, or is it somewhere in between?
It's somewhere in between, and it's all specific to each different artist. There's some artists that love being there at the very beginning and knocking ideas back and forth. There are some that I've worked with who just say, look, I want to draw cool stuff, but you tell me what to draw. And I will, I'm going to focus on the actual illustration. So it works both ways, or anywhere in that spectrum. I always start with the philosophy that it is a collaborative medium. I always say that it's only my story until such time as I start working with an artist, at which point it's our story. And I always encourage my artists to call, write, text, if they've got ideas, if they, see things that could be better, if they see things that they may have better idea about how to do X, Y, and Z. It takes me maybe 3 days off and on to do a script, but they're sitting on the pages for 30 days. So, they've got a lot more time to sort of drill down on it, and a lot more time to think, hey, you know what? Maybe if we did this instead of that, that makes for a better story. And I'm totally fine with that. I think that's how you get the best work. I don't want to work with art robots.
And when you're working on, you said, maybe some creators want to get started right away in the idea process. If you're working with a specific artist, are you thinking, well, let's say George Perez, is it something where you're thinking, well, he loves to draw millions of characters, a cast of thousands, so I'm going to make sure that the stories have that big size and scope, so that way he can, feel like he's in his wheelhouse?
Oh yeah, the first time I worked with DC with George at DC, I thought this is a chance to give George to get George to break out of his mold, and maybe he's tired of drawing 1 million characters on every page. Let's get him to stretch. Let's get him. So I wrote something specifically that was very, very light on characters showing up, like just a couple of characters. It was actually the Legion was showing up, and the Legion has like 35 characters. I put 4 of them in the story. First thing he did was he called me up and he said, I'm working on the cover. Who do you want on the cover? I said, you put these 4 Legionnaires. There's 35 of them. If you put more, just remember I have to put them in the story. But do what you want, George. So I get the book back, and the first page is 35 characters on them. So, all right, great. It's, you do you, George. That's great. You write to the skills of the artist. You write to the tastes of the artist. Michael Ringo, the great late Michael Ringo, who I work with Fantastic Four, had a much different attitude. His attitude was, give me something new to draw. You're nervous as a writer, nervous about asking for things that are really complex to draw, like the interiors of grocery stores or stadiums or whatever. And I remember specifically, I called them up. I needed a scene in an auto shop, in an auto repair shop, which is not a lot of fun to draw and is conceivably very complex if you really want to add background and make it feel like a real place. And his response was, great, I've never drawn that before. So that, again, it's different for every artist, but as long as you're working toward their strengths and listening to them, and again, hearing what they have to say, that's how you're going to get the best work. The lamest work I've done in comics has always been, here's a full script because you haven't picked an artist yet, Mr. Editor, and go with God. And then it can be, even in the cases of really good artists, there's still something that's not quite clicking. The marriage is not quite, you can sort of read the story and realize that it's not completely meshing, if that makes any sense.
So when you are working on a book that maybe you feel things just aren't quite right, how do you approach the artist and maybe say, hey, I see that there was something here. How do you make that conversation? Because I'm imagining there's egos involved. Do you go through the editor, or how do you dance around that issue?
I almost never go back to an artist and say, hey, we need this changed, or I'd like this changed, or this didn't quite hit the mark, because I'm so mindful of the fact that they're spending 10 times the amount of time I am on this. So generally it will just be something where I'll fix it in dialogue. I'll find I've been doing this since the Pleistocene era. I kind of know how to fix anything in dialogue or captions. On those rare cases where you kind of miss what I was saying here, first off, you go in it with some humility because you realize that a lot of times it's because you didn't explain yourself well in the script. I don't think it's ever been touchy. I don't think I've ever had a situation where I felt like I was in the lion's den and I was afraid of what was going to happen next. Most of the guys in comics, most of the women in comics are very aware too that it's a collaborative medium. If you're working with somebody with a gigantic ego who is not going to want to do that kind of stuff, you kind of know who they are ahead of time. And in my case, I just try not to work with them.
Now, when it comes to working with a collaborator, and let's say everything is really clicking, at what point do you realize that your ideas, their art, are just coming together so well, and maybe it's sales, or maybe it's just the feeling that you get, but how do you assess that moment?
It's a good question. I mean, it really is just a feeling that you get after a couple. I mean, it always takes a couple, 3 issues of a shakedown cruise because you're both getting used to each other. But at the point where I know they're adding to the story, they're coming up with new bits of business. They're not changing anything. Again, we're still telling the same story, but once I see them concretely sort of adding elements of the story, adding little bits of stage business or that sort of thing that let me know that we're on the same page, I just kind of relax and breathe out. And at that point, I very, very much like to split the credits differently. Generally in comics, it's writer, artist, or writer, penciler, inker. And I prefer storytellers, just straight up, because we're both in this together.
When you're working with a partner, maybe for some reason there's something that happens where you need a fill-in or something like that, and that could disrupt that flow. And how would you kind of make sure that hey, I'm going on my honeymoon this month, and there's going to be a fill-in? How do you make sure that that energy kind of goes from month to month without the readers feeling like there's been a letdown?
You pull tricks. I mean, one trick is to deliberately make it seem like an event where you're doing a flashback story, or you're doing a special story centering around this supporting character, this villain or whatever. That's one way to cheat it, and that's probably my best trick.
And when you're working on a book for an extended run, whether it's The Flash or Fantastic Four, Captain America, or the Legion of Superheroes, are you thinking of the end of your storyline, the arc, or is it just, I'm going to do this issue and next month there'll be a new idea, I hope, and we'll just keep going from there?
Am I thinking in terms of a grand design or a big finish? You're adorable. No, I found early on that I was writing kind of by the seat of my pants. I mean, in the very early days, I would, like all writers, I would, have everything down to a very, very tight outline before I started on anything. But I found that I got bored sort of writing the same thing twice in that sense. The fun of it for me is always, especially with ongoing series, is getting to a point in the story where you suddenly realize something you hadn't before. You suddenly have an insight on something that makes it exciting. Whether it's a big thing like, wait a minute, there's no reason that this villain has to live through this story, or maybe hey, I got a better idea for an ending all of a sudden. That, or small things. I was working on an Invisible Woman script a few months ago, and I love science. I'm a big science nerd, and I'm fascinated by what Sue Richard can do with her invisibility powers. How could you apply them in different ways? And the example that I stumbled across was, okay, well, invisibility is manipulating light waves. That's really what it is. How we see, obviously, is the way light waves bounce off an object and how our eyes register it. That's how we see. If you're Sue and you can manipulate light waves, you can change color of things. You can change, she's in a spy story, and I suddenly realized rather than have her put on a wig, she can just literally change the color of her hair or how we perceive the color of her hair. The little thing, like tiny little thing like that, boy, that just made my day because it was something I hadn't thought about before. The fun is in the journey, and especially with cliffhanger endings, I promise you, I almost never know how to resolve that cliffhanger when I write it. And at first, I thought that was a bug, and I come to realize it's a feature, because if I don't know and you don't know, you can't guess, we'll both be surprised.
Has anything changed in your writing style? Because, maybe 20 years ago, comics are still pretty much every month there's a new issue that comes out. That's the only way you can follow the story. Now with Amazon and bookstores having trade paperbacks, it seems that there's this drive for maybe 6 issues with a concrete beginning, middle, and end. So does that impact the way you work, or do you just keep going the way you're going?
It does. I do have to think a little bit in terms, not so much of where the story is going to end in issue 6, but more about where if I go in this general direction, where could we generally end up? What do I want that final story to be? And that, by the way, that almost always changes as I write. So it gives me a vague direction to go in. It's like taking a cross-country trip without a map, right? You start in New York, you know you're going to have to go through Chicago, you know you're going to have to go through in Nevada, but you don't have a map, so it's you know you're going to end up in California. It's just how you get there is more on the fly. I still very much try to and believe there's value in each individual issue having its own sort of arc, its own beginning, middle, and end, its own conflict resolution within the broader scope, like you would with it, like every TV show does. Like TV shows, they'll have a 22-episode season where there's an arc to the whole season, but within each, every week you get at least like a complete piece of entertainment to reduce it down to something simple like that. And I think that has value.
When we're looking at some of the older comics that you're working on compared to the work that you're doing now, we can always see your style that's written in there, but from a management point of view, are you hearing back, maybe they're telling you that the tastes have changed and your approach to action might be different, or maybe, the readers really don't like that humor that you're putting into that scene there. Is that something that you're hearing, or is this just, they're still trusting you, the Eisner Award-winning writer, to do your magic?
By the grace of God, they still trust me. I think that part of that is because I really do try to pay very close attention to what is happening out there, how comics change. I read the work of my contemporaries, the ones I really, really enjoy. And through osmosis, I'm not making deliberate changes. I'm not going to sit down and go, okay, I'm going to write this like Jason Aaron writes Avengers. but I do let that inform me. Otherwise, I really would still be writing exactly like I did 25 years ago, which would be a mistake because I learned so much about character. I've learned so much about how to put a story together. I've learned so much about being sensitive to what the audience wants without giving up what my style of what I'm trying to say. Keith Giffen, who has been at DC forever, writer artist, gave me one of the best pieces of advice I've ever heard. I asked him years ago. I said, "Look, Keith, you've been there for like 40 years, and you always have work. And not that you don't deserve it, you absolutely deserve it, but is there some secret to your longevity?" And he said, "Yeah." He says, "Find the thing that you do best and do it better than anybody else. And there's going to be times when it's not so much in favor, and there's going to be times when it's really in favor, but they're always going to want it. And if you're the only guy supplying it, especially when at times when tide changes shift, you're the guy they're going to go to." And I think I don't quite exactly know what the X factors are for me, but I think it's character. I think it's basically, I think I do such heavily character-based work that as long as there's an appetite for it, I'm lucky enough in a lot of cases to be the go-to guy.
I guess this is going to lead me to my next question, because we talked about artistic collaboration, but you've also written with other writers, and I'm wondering how your style can come through when you're bouncing those ideas off somebody else who also is going to be contributing.
It's not easy. I mean, the first thing you have to learn is that if you're co-writing with somebody, it's not half the work. It's actually both of you are doing all the same amount of work. You're just bouncing off each other, and you're having to, you can't write half a story and just hand it off to somebody and say, "You take it from here, I'll read it when it's printed." It's all got to hang together. Excuse me. And so the general process is we'll get on the phone, whether it's Brian Augustine or Tom Peyer or Carl Kiesel. We'll get on the phone. We'll figure out where we want to go. We'll knock around the basic ideas. With Tom and Brian, more often than not, they'll do like a rough first draft. I'll take it and sort of shape it into something that makes sense to me, adding, and sort of maybe putting my tone on it, and then pass it back. Because again, I'm not if we're co-writing, I'm not the final veto power. And generally, everything goes smoothly there, and then it goes in. But when you're writing together, like I said, it's not a matter of, here's 11 pages, go fix it, go do the back 11. It's very much a collaborative process still.
And I guess
kind of answer your question?
Absolutely, because to me it seems difficult. If I'm working on a project and I get somebody giving me feedback, that's one thing, but if it's something where I'm sharing the storytelling ability, I might feel precious about this moment. They might feel like this moment's really important, and yet we disagree on whether or not it should be in the story. So hearing how that works is to me very interesting. We have about 3 minutes before we have to end our conversation. I was wondering, you write a lot of different books, and I'm imagining that your day has to be fairly structured. So I was wondering if you could kind of tell me a little bit about what you do on the average work day to make sure that you get your ideas out and get the comics out.
I repeat, you're adorable. There is so little structure to my day, you would be appalled. Yesterday, I got up at 8 o'clock in the morning, sat in the writing chair, and didn't get up until 7 o'clock, except for a quick meal break here and there. Today, I have been puttering around all morning, answering emails and putting Lego sets together. So I kind of wish I did have more of a structure. But the more of a structure I have, the more it feels like a real job. And the more it feels like I should punch a clock and go into an office. The reason I chose freelance work is because I get to have that flexibility. And it helps me in the sense that I find more often than not, if something's not clicking on a story, if it's not coming together in my head, I can sit there for 8 hours and do bad draft after bad draft, but it didn't come. And then I'm in the shower the next day and suddenly everything appears to me in my head and I go do that. No matter what I would have done the previous day, no matter how I would have filled those 8 hours, I never would have had that inspiration the next day. You never know when it's going to hit, except to say that for 35 years, it's always hit just in the nick of time before an editor starts screaming for, where's my script?
And I see we have about a minute left. It's interesting because I tell my students when they're working on screenplays that they need to start with that small idea and just keep working. And even if it's not perfect, at least you have something written. Right. It seems that taking a moment to maybe reflect on why something isn't working is a great tool for a young writer.
I always say that writer's block is your subconscious telling you that somewhere in your story you've made a wrong turn. And that's why your subconscious is holding you back from finishing that piece of IKEA furniture because you skipped step 7. Go back to where, and I do this too, go back to where it worked. Go back to where it felt like it was working. And just for fun, turn left. See what happens. Throw a new character in. Try a completely different idea you haven't even thought about. Throw it down. Worst case scenario is that doesn't work either, but even still, it's getting things moving in your head. And if you're lucky, it turns out to be the right decision.
Mark, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule today to talk with me. I'd like to thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon. Comic Culture is a production of the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke.